You already know how the story begins. God creates Adam from the dust of the ground. God looks at Adam and decides he should not be alone. God creates the woman from Adam's rib, from his side, derivative, and secondary in sequence, if not in value. And her name is Eve. She is the first woman. That is what Genesis 2 says, and it is what the tradition built upon it has said for 2,000 years. That reading is not a distortion. It is what the text most naturally supports. Genesis 2 presents one man, one woman, one garden, and one original act of human creation. There is nothing on the surface of that account to disturb it, except that the Hebrew Bible preserves another trace in Isaiah 34:14. That verse contains a single Hebrew word, Lilit, placed without explanation in a list of creatures inhabiting a destroyed land. The Septuagint tradition renders it as a donkey centaur. The Vulgate renders it as a child-devouring monster. The King James renders it as a screech owl. Major translations have reached sharply different answers because no generation of translators has agreed on what it was looking at. Medieval Jewish literature, a text called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, eventually gave the word a biography. This was Adam's first wife, created simultaneously with him from the same earth, who refused subordination, spoke the ineffable name of God aloud, and flew away to the Red Sea. Her name is Lilith. And the question of where she came from, whether she was invented, preserved from a Mesopotamian demonological tradition, or constructed to resolve a tension the Bible left open, is one the Hebrew tradition has never settled. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what the Hebrew Bible says about Lilith, which is almost nothing, and why that silence is as theologically significant as anything it does say. You will understand the Mesopotamian demonological background from which the Hebrew Lilit likely draws, the specific class of demonic figures in Babylonian and Sumerian sources, whose characteristics overlap in striking and specific ways with the later Jewish Lilith. You will understand the Alphabet of Ben Sira and why medieval Jewish scholars constructed a full biography for a figure the canonical text reduced to a single word. And you will understand why Lilith, in the form later tradition made her, functions as the tradition's answer to a question Genesis never fully closes. What happened before Eve, and what the existence of that prior figure means for everything the tradition built on Eve's singularity. The question Lilith raises is not merely historical, it is structural. If the tradition preserves traces of a prior woman, a figure created equal, refusing subordination, eventually placed into the gap the creation narrative left open, then the theology of gender, creation, and human origins that Western civilization inherited is built on a foundation that was chosen, not discovered. The text had a tension. Later tradition supplied a figure to inhabit it, and the specific way that tradition managed that figure, whether by elaboration, by amulets, by Kabbalistic systematization, or by canonical silence, has shaped how half the human race has been understood for 2,000 years. The Alphabet of Ben Sira records that after Lilith left Eden, God sent 3 angels, Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semangaloth, to bring her back. She refused. The angels threatened to kill 100 of her demon children every day if she did not return. She accepted the punishment rather than go back. The text records her exact response. She said she was created specifically to harm newborn children, and that is what she would do. She made the angels swear that wherever her name or their images appeared, she would have no power over that child. Amulets bearing the three angels' names were placed in nurseries across the Jewish world for centuries. Isaiah 34:14 contains a single Hebrew word, Lilit, that is the entire canonical foundation for a figure 2,000 years of tradition built enormous apparatus around. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what the word means, why every major translation renders it differently, and what that translational disagreement reveals about the tradition's discomfort with what it was looking at. Isaiah 34 is an oracle against Edom, a prophecy of total desolation addressed to one of Israel's ancient enemies. The land of Edom, Isaiah declares, will be given over to fire and pitch, to thorns and jackals, to creatures that inhabit the margins of the human world. The rhetorical purpose of the creature list in verse 14 is precise. The more desolate and inhospitable the beings that take up residence, the more complete the annihilation the text is describing. This is not a bestiary, it is a scale of absence. Every creature named is a measure of how thoroughly the human has been evacuated from the land. The verse names the wild goat, Sahir in Hebrew, a creature already carrying demonic associations in the Levitical tradition. It names jackals, ostriches, hyenas. These are animals of the waste, the margins, the places between habitation and wilderness. They anchor the verse in recognizable natural desolation. And then, the Lilit, Isaiah 34, verse 14. Wild goats, jackals, ostriches, hyenas. And then, Lilit. One word, one creature, no article, no explanation. The translators have never agreed on what it is. The tradition built 2,000 years of apparatus around it. This is the entire canonical foundation. One word that nobody could translate and nobody could ignore. The translational history of this single word is itself an argument about discomfort. The Septuagint tradition renders it as onokantauros, a donkey centaur, a hybrid creature from Greek mythological tradition that the translators apparently reached for because they needed something recognizably monstrous. The Vulgate renders it Lamia, a figure from Greek and Roman tradition who devours children, a choice that reveals the translator's sense of what the Hebrew was gesturing at. The King James renders it screech owl, rationalizing the creature into natural history. The Revised Standard Version renders it night hag, closer to the demonic register, but still hesitating at a full mythological commitment. Modern translations oscillate between night creature, night monster, and night bird, each option reflecting a different decision about how much the tradition should be allowed to intrude into a plain text reading. No two major translations reach the same answer. The disagreement is not accidental. It reflects the fact that the tradition itself has never resolved what the word points to, and that the instinct of every generation of translators has been to domesticate the reference rather than face what it might mean. The etymology does not resolve the question, though it narrows it. Lilit derives most plausibly from Lael, the Hebrew word for night, a figure of the darkness, the nocturnal. the hours outside the ordered light of creation. There is a competing derivation from the Akkadian Lilitu, a storm or wind spirit, which would root the word in Mesopotamian demonic tradition rather than Hebrew etymology alone. Both derivations carry the same atmospheric register. This is a figure associated with darkness, the margins, the inhospitable, the hours when the human world loses its legibility. What the single canonical reference preserves is significant for what it does not do. It names the creature. It places it in specific company: desolate margins, ruins, wild things. It does not explain what it is, does not give it history, does not assign it a role in the divine order. This is not ignorance. The tradition that produced Isaiah knew what it was doing with its demonological vocabulary. The choice not to explain is an act of restraint that is itself theologically significant. The figure is present enough to name, dangerous enough to place, and too complicated to develop. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide corroboration that extends the figure beyond Isaiah. The scrolls preserve exorcistic material in which Lilith appears among dangerous demonic spirits. Texts associated with the Songs of the Sage, particularly 4 Q510 to 511, contain protective and apotropaic formulas in which she is named and commanded to depart. These are not casual folk documents. The presence of Lilith in this material shows that she belonged not merely to popular folklore, but to serious Jewish apotropaic and exorcistic practice, a demonic figure known and feared in Second Temple Judaism well over 1,000 years before the Alphabet of Ben Sira gave her a biography. The tradition's practical response to Lilith, the protective formulas, the amulets, the names placed in nurseries, predates the full biography by centuries. The Second Temple communities were already performing protective rites against her before anyone had written down the story of why she left Eden. That reversal, the protection preceding the explanation, has not yet been addressed. What the canonical text preserves, then, is not the whole of the tradition's relationship with this figure. It preserves the official minimum, one word placed carefully, in a context of desolation and abandonment. Everything else, the fear, the apparatus, the centuries of management, exists around that word, not in it. The canon contains the trace. The tradition around the canon contains the weight. But that weight did not originate in Hebrew. The canonical text gives the figure a Hebrew name and a single Hebrew verse. The fear that name carried, the specific modes of harm attributed to it, the specific targets, the specific countermeasures, came from somewhere older and further east. The oldest surviving account of a figure overlapping with Lilith in every relevant particular was not written in Hebrew. It was written in cuneiform, in a tradition that predates Isaiah by centuries. The question of where the demonological background behind the Hebrew word came from has an answer. The answer begins in Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamian demonic tradition contains a class of female storm spirits, Lilitu and Ardat Lili, whose characteristics overlap with the later Jewish Lilith in ways that are striking and specific. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly who these figures are in their original context, what they do, and why the correspondence between them and the Hebrew Lilit is one of the strongest explanations for why the biblical word appears in the form it does. The Lilitu family of demons, in Babylonian and Assyrian exorcistic literature, represents a distinct class of supernatural threat. The family comprises three figures: the Lilu, a male storm demon; the Lilitu, a female counterpart associated with wind and nocturnal intrusion; and the Ardat Lili, a type of young female demon whose name translates variously as Maid of the Wind or Storm Maiden, depending on the scholarly source consulted. These figures appear across centuries of cuneiform, medical, and exorcistic texts, consistently associated with a specific cluster of harms: disease, infant death, erotic disturbance, and the prevention of conception. The Ardat Lili is the most specific of the three and the most directly relevant. In Babylonian exorcistic texts, analyzed by the scholar Tzvi Abush in his work on Mesopotamian witchcraft, the Ardat Lili appears as a female spirit who attaches herself to men, visits them in erotic dreams, prevents the women in their households from conceiving, and harms or kills newborn children. The overlap with later Jewish Lilith's attributed functions is striking. The same targets, the same modes of harm, the same nocturnal register, the same specific vulnerability in the household it enters. The figures are not identical, and the line of direct transmission cannot be traced with certainty. But the overlap is too specific and too consistent to be treated as coincidence. The so-called Bernie relief, or Queen of the Night plaque, dating to approximately 1800 to 1750 BC and now in the British Museum, is frequently brought into modern discussions of Lilith. It depicts a nude winged female figure standing on lions, flanked by owls with taloned bird feet. But its identification is genuinely contested. It has been attributed to Lilitu, to Ishtar, and to Ereshkigal, and the case for any one identification remains open. It should not be used as direct evidence for Lilith herself. What it does demonstrate is that the ancient Near Eastern visual imagination was comfortable with a particular iconographic type: the powerful, winged, liminal female figure associated with predatory birds and wilderness margins. That is the symbolic field into which later visual tradition would eventually place Lilith. But the plaque itself belongs to the wider context, not to her specifically. The connection between these Mesopotamian figures and the Hebrew Lilit is one of the strongest explanations available for why the biblical word appears in the form it does. The Babylonian exile of the 6th century BC placed Jewish communities in sustained contact with exactly this demonological tradition. The exilic and post-exilic periods are precisely the centuries when Jewish angelology and demonology develop their most systematic elaboration. The same period when figures like the Watchers, the Divine Council, and the hierarchy of demonic adversaries acquire the theological weight they carry in post-exilic literature. A community literate in Babylonian religious culture, living in cities where the Lilu tradition was ambient, would have had every opportunity to recognize the correspondence between the Babylonian storm demons and the Hebrew word their own scriptures had preserved without explanation. What the Mesopotamian background establishes is this: Lilith as a demonic figure is not a medieval invention, and not simply a product of late Jewish imagination working on a single, ambiguous biblical word. The Hebrew Lilit likely drew on a demonological field that existed in Mesopotamian tradition centuries before the Hebrew canon reached its fixed form. The canonical text preserved only the name, leaving the figure undeveloped. It could not prevent the figure from accumulating meaning in the surrounding tradition, because the surrounding tradition was already breathing the same demonological atmosphere the exile had introduced. The Mesopotamian origin of Lilitu and Ardat Lili deserves a dedicated treatment of its own. The full texture of the Babylonian demonic tradition and what it reveals about the religious world the Hebrew canon was formed within is a separate argument, and one this series will return to. The Mesopotamian tradition provides a demonological background for the Hebrew Lilit, a class of figure with specific targets, specific modes of harm, and specific characteristics that resonate across centuries of later Jewish elaboration of Lilith. But the question that background does not answer is the one the tradition most needed to resolve. How does a Babylonian storm demon become Adam's first wife? The answer to that question is in a medieval text that most scholars treat as a joke, and which may have drawn in the form of satire on material older than its composition date suggests. The Alphabet of Ben Sira, a medieval Jewish satirical text from approximately the 8th to 10th century AD, contains the first complete account of Lilith as Adam's first wife, created equal, refusing subordination, flying away to the Red Sea. By the end of this chapter, you will understand why scholars debate whether this is medieval invention or ancient recovery, and why the answer changes what the tradition's management of Lilith actually means. The Alphabet of Ben Sira is a genuinely strange text. It is ribald, deliberately provocative, and frequently absurd. A compilation of sayings attributed to the sage Ben Sira, framed with explanatory stories, some of which are clearly designed to shock the reader out of pious complacency. It includes material that is difficult to read as straightforwardly serious theology. Gershom Scholem, the preeminent scholar of Jewish mysticism in the 20th century, argued in his work on Kabbalah that the first wife narrative in the alphabet is essentially a medieval construction, an explanatory myth created to account for the single word Lilit in Isaiah 34, and to provide a narrative rationale for the amulet tradition that had been established in Jewish households for centuries. The satirical register of the text supports this reading. The story of Adam's first wife, refusing subordination and flying away, may be a learned joke, the kind of midrashic provocation that medieval scholars produced precisely to test and challenge received interpretations. Scholem's position is not a fringe view. It is a serious scholarly caution issued by the most significant scholar the field has produced. The story the alphabet tells is this: God created Adam and a woman simultaneously, both from the earth, both made of the same dust, in the same act of creation. Conflict arose immediately. Adam expected the woman to lie beneath him. The woman, having been created from the same earth in the same moment, refused. She argued that she was his equal in origin and would not accept subordination. When Adam attempted to compel her by force, she spoke the ineffable name of God aloud, the Tetragrammaton, the name too sacred for ordinary utterance, and was lifted into the air. She flew to the Red Sea. She did not return. The alphabet records God sending the three angels Senoi, Sansonoi, and Semangeloth after her. They found her at the Red Sea, a place the tradition associates with demons and the margins of the ordered world. They commanded her return. She refused. They threatened to drown 100 of her demon children daily if she did not go back to Adam. She accepted the terms. She told the angels she was created specifically to cause illness and death to newborn children, male infants during their first 8 days of life, female infants during their first 20 days. She agreed that wherever her name or the names of the three angels were displayed or written, she would have no power over that child. The deal was struck. She remained at the Red Sea. The amulets began. Now, the grounds on which Sholom's caution is insufficient. The Dead Sea Scrolls material predates the alphabet by over 1,000 years, and the exorcistic texts associated with the songs of the sage, particularly 4 Q510 to 511, name Lilith among dangerous spirits requiring protective formula. The communities that preserved those texts were already performing rites against Lilith before anyone had written down the story of why she required protection. The alphabet did not invent the amulet tradition. It provided a narrative explanation for a practice that was already established. A text that explains a practice cannot be the source of that practice. The Babylonian Talmud, which predates the alphabet by several centuries, preserves 2 significant references. Tractate Shabbat 151 warns men against sleeping alone in a house because of Lilith's nocturnal visits. Tractate Eruvin 100b describes Lilith as a figure with long hair and wings. These are not references to a folk story from the alphabet. They are references to a figure already present in the tradition, a figure whose characteristics the Talmudic rabbis regarded as settled enough to warrant a practical warning. The alphabet is downstream of the Talmud, not upstream of it. The specific structural elements of the first wife narrative also merit attention. The pattern of a primordial female figure who is simultaneously created with the male figure, who conflicts with him over status, who departs and takes up residence in a liminal or demonic space, and who is then subject to a negotiated constraint. This pattern has parallels in Mesopotamian mythological structures that a medieval author working in the 8th to 10th century AD would not have had direct access to. The structural parallel is not proof of direct transmission. It is evidence that the alphabet is drawing on older mythological material, even when it is systematizing that material into a new narrative form. The correct scholarly framing is not invention versus recovery. It is elaboration of an ancient figure into a new narrative form. The Alphabet of Ben Sira almost certainly did not invent Lilith, the Mesopotamian demonic tradition, the amulet practice, or the Talmudic warnings. It invented the specific first wife biography in its complete form: the Red Sea, the negotiation, the three angels, the terms of the deal. That specific narrative is almost certainly medieval. The figure it explains is ancient. As this series established through Gadriel, the Eden narrative was already a site of competing traditions, a named watcher present in the Enochic literature, absent from the canonical account. Lilith extends that territory further, a figure whose extra-canonical presence in Jewish protective and exorcistic tradition is as theologically significant as her near absence from the canon itself. What these 3 chapters have assembled is not a mythology survey. It is the evidence base for a single, specific claim. The tradition actively managed Lilith across multiple centuries in multiple textual registers, from Isaiah to Qumran, to the Talmud, to the alphabet. And that management consistently preceded the biography it eventually produced. The amulets came before the story. The exorcisms came before the name. The fear came before the explanation. The second half of this video asks what the tradition was afraid of, and why its management of that fear left so many traces that the suppression is more visible than what it was suppressing. Whether the alphabet invented or recovered the first wife narrative, it was explaining a practice already entrenched across centuries of Jewish life, nurseries protected by angels' names, men warned against sleeping alone, exorcisms performed against a figure the canonical text barely acknowledges. The amulet tradition is the most specific evidence available for how seriously the tradition took Lilith. And understanding what that protection was actually guarding against requires going back to what Lilith accepted rather than return to Eden. Protective amulets bearing the names Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semangelof were placed in nurseries across the Jewish world for centuries. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what the Alphabet of Ben Sira says these amulets protect against, why Lilith accepted the arrangement, and what the widespread practice reveals about how seriously the tradition treated a figure it officially suppressed. This is the amulet tradition named at the opening. We are here. The alphabet's account of the negotiation is worth examining in detail. The 3 angels find Lilith at the Red Sea in the company of demons. They deliver God's command. She refuses it. The threat of 100 dead children daily is not a casual bargaining counter. The tradition presents it as the specific vulnerability through which she could be constrained, which implies she had something to lose from the arrangement as well as something to gain. She accepts the terms. But the terms she accepts are not capitulation. They are a jurisdictional agreement. Her power is real, her threat is ongoing, but it can be limited by specific knowledge deployed in specific ways. The specificity of the deal matters. She claims authority over male infants for the first 8 days of life, and female infants for the first 20 days. The 8-day male vulnerability aligns precisely with the pre-circumcision period, the ritual that, in Jewish tradition, formally incorporates a male child into the covenant, a figure whose power is strongest in the days before that incorporation is not a random demon. She is a figure whose threat is precisely theological, targeted at the moment before the child has been formally claimed by the covenant community. Whether or not that alignment was intended by the alphabet's author, the tradition received it as meaningful. The archaeological evidence precedes the textual account. Incantation bowls excavated from Jewish communities in Babylonia, dated to the 3rd through 7th centuries AD, bear inscriptions directly naming Lilith and commanding her departure. These are not literary artifacts. They are household objects, buried in the corners and beneath the thresholds of domestic spaces, performing the protective function that the alphabet later narrates. Some bowls depict Lilith bound with chains, restrained, commanded to leave. Some bear her image inverted, her power rendered inert by the gesture of turning her upside down. The care and specificity of these objects, produced across centuries and across geographically distributed communities, is not the evidence of a superstition maintained out of cultural habit. It is the evidence of a community that genuinely believed the threat was real and the protection was necessary. The gap this establishes between official canonical theology and lived religious practice is significant. Isaiah 34:14 gives Lilith one word. The canonical text never develops her, never explains her, never assigns her a role in the divine order. The tradition around the canon, the practical religious life of Jewish communities across the ancient and medieval world, treats her as a specific ongoing threat, requiring specific ongoing countermeasures embedded in the physical fabric of domestic space. The official silence and the practical urgency are simultaneous. They coexisted for centuries in the same communities. Samael's role as Lilith's Kabbalistic consort, a figure this series will examine directly when we reach his own episode, introduces a further dimension. In the Zohar, the foundational text of medieval Kabbalah, Zohar 1:19b, Lilith sits at the left hand of God opposite the Shekinah, the divine presence. She rules the world of the Qalefoth, the husks, the shells, the negative emanations that mirror and invert the divine light. Samael, the angel of death, is her consort and counterpart. Together, they represent the cosmic shadow side of the divine structure, not chaos external to the divine order, but the shadow within it. This is Kabbalah's attempt to systematize and contain a figure the tradition had spent centuries failing to eliminate, to give her a structural place within the divine cosmology, precisely because excluding her had not worked. The amulet tradition, the Talmudic warnings, the Kabbalistic cosmology, collectively they represent a tradition that spent over 1,000 years trying to find a framework capacious enough to contain a figure it could not make disappear. The question the containment effort raises is not why the tradition feared Lilith. It is what specifically about Lilith required so much apparatus to manage, what she represented that ordinary demonological containment could not account for. The answer to that question is not in the demonic tradition. It is in Genesis 1. Genesis 1:27 states that God created humanity male and female together. Genesis 2:21-22 presents the woman as formed later from the man's side. On a source-critical reading, these are two distinct creation accounts with different sequences and theological emphases. Later tradition worked to harmonize them. The tension is real. Later tradition eventually placed Lilith in that tension. The scholarly framework for understanding the Genesis disharmony is the documentary hypothesis, the well-established scholarly argument that the Pentateuch preserves materials from distinct source traditions edited together in the post-exilic period. Genesis 1 is generally attributed to the priestly source, systematic, cosmic, theologically organized, presenting creation in ordered stages, culminating in the simultaneous creation of male and female humanity in the image of God. Genesis 2 is generally attributed to the Yahwist source, intimate, narrative, anthropomorphic, presenting God as a craftsman who shapes the human from dust, plants a garden, and then decides the human needs a companion. The two accounts use different divine names, present different creation sequences, and carry different theological emphases. The tradition that canonized both accounts did not harmonize them. It preserved both, which is itself a theological decision. The consequence of Genesis 1's simultaneous creation is one the tradition rarely articulates directly. If Genesis 1 is read as a distinct creation account rather than as a prologue to Genesis 2, then the female figure of Genesis 1 does not map neatly onto Eve, as Genesis 2 presents her. Eve appears in Genesis 2 created specifically from Adam's rib, after Adam already exists, as a companion designed in response to his loneliness. That is a different origin sequence from the simultaneous creation of Genesis 1. The harmonizing tradition reads them as one event described twice. The source critical tradition reads them as two events from different hands. And it is precisely in that gap, the gap between readings, that the tradition eventually placed a prior woman. That woman is Lilith, in the form the alphabet gave her. The structural logic of how the first wife narrative functions follows from this reading. The creation theology of Genesis 2, the woman as derivative of the man, created from his body, brought to him as a companion, sits in tension with the simultaneous creation of Genesis 1. Lilith's first wife narrative, in the form the alphabet gives it, inhabits that tension directly. A woman created simultaneously from the same earth, who refused subordination precisely because she understood her origin as equal. Whether or not the alphabet's author intended this as a commentary on Genesis's internal contradiction, the narrative structure does that work regardless. The structure of the story is the argument, the modern recuperation of Lilith as a figure of female autonomy, in feminist theology, in popular culture, in the symbolic language of contemporary gender discourse, draws on precisely this reading. Whether or not that reading is historically accurate as an account of what the alphabet intended, it correctly identifies what the narrative structure of the first wife's story makes available: a prior woman, created equal, whose refusal of subordination was the reason she had to be placed outside the garden and outside the canon. The modern recuperation is the consequence of a figure the tradition managed but never permanently contained. That is acknowledged here as a historical consequence of the tradition's engagement with Lilith, not as this script's own argument. The register is textual and historical. The fear the tradition's management of Lilith reflects was not primarily a fear of the demonic. It was, in the alphabet's framing, a fear of what a figure created equal and refusing subordination did to the creation hierarchy that Genesis 2 established. The demonic biography was the container. The structural tension was what required containing. Lilith is what later tradition placed in the gap between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the figure that inhabited the tension those two accounts produce when they are read as distinct rather than harmonized. The question the tradition's management of that figure raises is whether the management was a success, or whether the sheer volume of apparatus built around her is itself the evidence that it was not. Every attempt to contain, explain, or dismiss Lilith produced more Lilith, more texts, more amulets, more cosmological frameworks. By the end of this chapter, you will understand why the silence around Lilith in the canonical text is the most convincing evidence that she was never containable, and what that paradox reveals about the nature of the tradition's relationship with its own internal tensions. The paradox of the apparatus is this: the more thoroughly the canonical text left Lilith undeveloped, one word, no biography, no role in the creation account, the more elaborate the extra-canonical tradition around her became. Isaiah 34:14 gives her one word. The rest of the tradition gives her thousands: exorcism formulas, amulet inscriptions, Talmudic warnings, Kabbalistic cosmology, mystical biography, narrative elaboration, protective ritual. The canonical silence did not reduce the tradition around Lilith. It expanded it. Every act of textual restraint was met with extra-canonical elaboration, as if the tradition's imaginative life was filling the space the official text had left unoccupied. Mainstream Christian theology made a different choice. It inherited the same canonical text and largely left the Lilit reference undeveloped. The figure who occupied so much of Jewish tradition's attention for centuries remained comparatively marginal in mainstream Christian demonology, which preferred to elaborate the serpent-Satan identification and place the adversarial principle at the center of its cosmological narrative. Two traditions, working from the same canonical source, made completely different decisions about what to do with the figure lurking in the margins. The Jewish tradition kept engaging with her. The Christian tradition mostly declined to. The divergence is itself a data point. The figure's persistence in Jewish tradition is not simply a consequence of universal human fascination with demonic female figures. It reflects something specific to the Jewish tradition's relationship with its own Genesis narrative. The comparison with Christian tradition is instructive in a further register. Ethiopian Christianity, which retained the Book of Enoch as canonical scripture, maintained a more developed engagement with the tradition of beings present in Eden's prehistory. A pattern consistent with the Enochic cosmology's preservation of figures, the Western canon largely set aside. The canon's boundaries shape what a tradition is able to remember. That observation applies to Lilith as directly as it applies to the Watchers. The most significant consequence of canonical restraint rather than canonical inclusion is this: a figure incorporated into the canonical text would have been subject to canonical interpretation. Defined, contained, assigned a fixed role within the authorized account, her meaning closed by the act of inclusion. A figure left undeveloped in the canon, but preserved in the surrounding tradition, maintained interpretive fluidity. Every generation of readers could find in Lilith what it needed to find. The Talmudic rabbis found a nocturnal threat to be warned against. The Kabbalists found a cosmic counterpart to the divine feminine. The amulet makers found a specific danger to be contained by specific names. The modern recuperators found the tradition's alternative to Eve's singularity. The canonical restraint, paradoxically, made Lilith more rather than less available to the tradition's imaginative life. Inclusion would have fixed her. The one undeveloped word kept her open. The question of what the suppressed female divine in the Hebrew tradition more broadly represents, the figures written out of or diminished within the canonical account, from Asherah to the woman of Genesis 1, is one this series will address directly in a future episode. The territory is larger than Lilith, and the pattern is the same. Isaiah 34:14. A single word, Lilit, in a list of desert creatures inhabiting the ruins of Edom. The entire canonical foundation for everything that followed, never explained, never developed, never named again in the Hebrew Bible. The Mesopotamian tradition, Lilitu and Ardat Lili in Babylonian and Sumerian exorcistic sources, wind demons and storm spirits who harm children and haunt men at night, a tradition that predates the Hebrew Bible by centuries and overlaps with later Jewish Lilith in ways that are too specific and consistent to ignore. The same targets, the same modes of harm, the same nocturnal intrusion, the same specific domestic vulnerability. The Dead Sea Scrolls, exorcistic material in the songs of the sage naming Lilith among dangerous spirits, showing that she was not a medieval literary invention, but a demonic figure known in Second Temple Jewish protective practice. 1,000 years before, the biography gave her a story. The Alphabet of Ben Sira, the medieval text that gave the undeveloped figure a complete biography, created equal, refused subordination, spoke the name of God, flew away to the Red Sea, accepted the death of 100 children daily rather than return. Whether that biography was invented or elaborated from older material, it answered a question Genesis left open and explained a practice already centuries established. The Amulet tradition, nurseries across the Jewish world protected by the three angels' names from the ancient world through the medieval period. Incantation bowls buried in household thresholds, treating a figure the canonical text barely acknowledged as a specific ongoing threat, requiring specific ongoing countermeasures. The question Genesis never answers: what happened in the gap between simultaneous creation and the rib, and what the figure later tradition placed into that gap means for the theology of creation, gender, and human origins. That 2,000 years of tradition built on Eve's singularity. The text preserved the gap. Later tradition preserved Lilith. The gap is still there. The tradition's relationship with Lilith is not a relationship of silence, followed by forgetting. It is a relationship of canonical restraint, followed by persistent extra-canonical return. She is barely in the text, and she is everywhere in the tradition around it, in the amulets in the nurseries, in the Talmudic warnings about sleeping alone, in Kabbalistic cosmology, where she sits at the left hand of God, opposite the Shekinah, in medieval demonology, where she is queen of the demonic world and Samael's consort, in modern culture, where she has been recovered as a symbol of everything the tradition's management of her feared, and reclaimed as exactly that. What the tradition could never decide is whether Lilith was a demon who needed to be contained, a figure whose absence from the canon required explanation, or a theological problem that needed to be solved. Every century that engaged with her produced a different answer. None of the answers resolved the question. The question is still open because the text that should have closed it, Genesis 1 and 2, the two creation accounts, does not read the same way in every tradition. On a source-critical reading, Genesis 1 creates male and female simultaneously. Genesis 2 creates the woman from the man's rib. The harmonizing tradition reconciles them. The tension remains available to those who do not harmonize. And Lilith, in the form later tradition gave her, is what lives in that available tension. The apparatus the tradition built around that tension is, in retrospect, extraordinary. Exorcisms in Second Temple, Jewish protective literature. Amulets in nurseries from Babylon to Europe. Talmudic warnings passed from generation to generation. Kabbalistic cosmologies that gave her a throne and a consort and a kingdom of her own. Every piece of that apparatus was built to manage something the official text had left undeveloped. And every piece of it is evidence that the management never fully resolved what it was managing. She kept coming back. She is still coming back. And the word at the root of her name, Lilit, Lyle, the Hebrew word for night, suggests that what she represents has always been the thing the tradition most found difficult about the dark. Not evil exactly. Something older than evil. Something that was there before the light was named.